When I think back to the beginning, it almost feels like a different life. My wife, Emily, and I had been married for 7 years, and I'd always thought we had a solid relationship. Sure, there were ups and downs, as with any couple, but we were a team. We shared inside jokes, made big plans for the future, and supported each other through everything. We had settled into what I thought was the perfect life in a quiet suburb just outside of Indianapolis. Our house wasn't anything extravagant, but it was ours, a cozy 2-story home with a wide front porch and a backyard big enough for summer barbecues and lazy Sunday afternoons. It sat on a cul-de-sac in a neighborhood where everyone knew each other's names, and it felt safe, like a bubble away from the chaos of the world. Emily loved the community aspect of it all. She thrived on neighborhood gatherings, chatting with everyone at block parties and organizing potlucks. Me? I was more of an introvert. I enjoyed a beer in the backyard with a couple of close friends, but I didn't care much for mingling with the entire street. Emily balanced that out for me, though. Her warmth and outgoing nature brought a vibrancy to our home that I always appreciated. We had a couple of close neighbors that we interacted with regularly. Next door to us lived Rick and Lisa. Rick was a bit older, maybe in his early 50s, and had a confident, easygoing charm that seemed to draw people in. Lisa, his wife, was a sweet but quiet woman who often seemed content to let Rick be the center of attention. They had lived there long before we moved in, and Rick especially had become something of an unofficial mayor of the cul-de-sac. Life was simple and predictable back then. Emily worked part-time at a local boutique, while I had a steady job as a project manager for a construction company. We weren't rolling in money, but we didn't have to worry about bills, either. We spent our evenings watching our favorite shows, cooking dinner together, or sitting on the porch, talking about everything and nothing. Looking back now, I realize how much I took those moments for granted. If I'd known how quickly things would unravel, I might have cherished them more. But at the time, I thought we were happy. I thought we were safe. It's strange how life has a way of creeping up on you, blindsiding you when you least expect it. The signs were there, small and almost insignificant, but I was too content, too trusting to notice. It was a peaceful life, one I believed would last forever. That belief, as I would come to find out, was nothing more than an illusion. Our neighborhood was the kind of place you'd see on a postcard, tree-lined streets, perfectly trimmed lawns, and kids riding bikes in the summer. Most of the houses were similar in style, built sometime in the early 2000s, with white picket fences and flower beds out front. The homeowners took pride in their properties, and there was an unspoken competition to see who could have the greenest grass or the most colorful garden. Emily and I were no exception. We spent many weekends sprucing up our yard. She loved flowers, azaleas and tulips in particular, so we planted a row of them along the walkway leading to our front door. I took care of the lawn, mowing it every Saturday morning while Emily fussed over her little herb garden by the back patio. It was small but satisfying work, and it made our house feel like home. Of course, Rick, our next-door neighbor, always had the best-looking lawn on the block. I used to joke that he must water it with liquid gold or have some secret formula he wasn't sharing. Rick would laugh, leaning casually against his fence, and say something like, "Hard work and good fertilizer, my friend." He and Emily got along particularly well. Rick had a way of making everyone feel like an old friend, and Emily enjoyed his company. Whenever we were out working on the yard, it wasn't uncommon for Rick to wander over and strike up a conversation. Sometimes, he'd offer to lend us tools or give tips on landscaping, and while I appreciated his advice, I was never one to spend hours chatting over the fence. That was more Emily's thing. Looking back, I can't say there was anything out of the ordinary about it. Rick was just one of those guys who made himself available. He'd help out around the neighborhood, fixing a leaky pipe here or lending a hand with a heavy piece of furniture there. Lisa, his wife, would sometimes join him, but more often than not, she seemed content to stay inside. She wasn't unfriendly, just more reserved than Rick. Emily and I had a good dynamic back then. She was the social butterfly, and I was the quiet observer. It worked for us. I never minded that she was more outgoing, more engaged with the neighbors. I trusted her completely, and I trusted the people around us. After all, we lived in a close-knit community where everyone looked out for one another. What could go wrong in a place like that? It's funny, in a dark and ironic way, how blind trust can sometimes set you up for the biggest betrayals. At the time, I didn't think twice about Emily spending more time with Rick. She'd mention borrowing something, a cup of sugar, a wrench, whatever, and I wouldn't give it a second thought. If anything, I felt lucky. Not every neighborhood had a guy like Rick who was always willing to help. And I figured that Lisa probably appreciated Emily's friendliness too. But things were about to change. Small shifts, barely noticeable at first, began to disrupt the rhythm of our lives. The signs were subtle, little things I brushed off as coincidences. It wouldn't be long before I realized how wrong I was. The first sign of trouble came in the form of lawn care, something that would have seemed laughably insignificant to me at the time. Emily had never shown much interest in mowing the grass or pulling weeds. That was my territory. She used to joke about how much she hated getting dirt under her nails, which was why she preferred tending to her herb garden or arranging flowers on the porch. Then, one weekend, she decided out of the blue that she wanted to help with the lawn. "I think I'll take a crack at mowing today," she announced one Saturday morning, flashing me an unusually bright smile as we finished breakfast. I nearly choked on my coffee. "Seriously? You hate mowing the lawn," I said, trying to keep the surprise out of my voice. "I know," she replied, shrugging. "But maybe I'll grow to like it. Besides, you've been doing it for years. It's about time I pitched in, don't you think?" I didn't argue. If she wanted to help, I wasn't about to stop her. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't like Emily to suddenly take an interest in chores she used to avoid like the plague. I chalked it up to a phase, maybe she was just bored or looking for a new way to stay active. At first, I didn't think much of it. She didn't last long behind the mower that day, complaining about how heavy it was and asking me to finish the job after about 20 minutes. But the next weekend, she was back out there, trimming the edges of the lawn with a determination I hadn't seen before. She also started visiting Rick more often. It began innocently enough. She'd mention needing to borrow something, like a set of pruning shears or a measuring cup. I didn't think twice about it. Rick had always been generous with his tools and gadgets, and Emily had always been the type to chat with neighbors. But then the visits became more frequent. "I'm heading over to Rick's for a minute," she'd say, grabbing her phone and slipping out the door. Sometimes, she'd come back with whatever she had gone to borrow. Other times, she'd return empty-handed, saying she'd just been caught up talking. One day, I noticed her returning from Rick's yard with a small smudge of dirt on her jeans and a strange, almost nervous energy. "What were you doing over there?" I asked casually, trying not to sound like I was prying. "Oh, Rick was showing me how to reseed some bare patches in the lawn," she said, brushing it off like it was nothing. "I thought we could try it on ours." I nodded, but something about the way she avoided eye contact stuck with me. Emily wasn't the type to care much about reseeding grass, let alone spend half an afternoon learning how to do it. Still, I told myself I was imagining things. There was no reason not to trust her, right? But once you start noticing oddities, it's hard to stop. Over the next few weeks, her trips to Rick's house became a regular occurrence. She'd pop over to borrow a tool, ask for advice on something trivial, or drop off a dish she'd baked. Sometimes, she'd stay longer than I expected, and I'd catch myself glancing out the window, wondering what was taking her so long. I tried to brush off the unease creeping into my chest. This was Emily, my wife, the woman I'd built a life with. And this was Rick, our friendly neighbor. There was no reason to think anything untoward was happening. They were just being neighborly. At least, that's what I kept telling myself. But deep down, a small, nagging voice was starting to question everything. As the weeks went by, that small voice in my head grew louder. Something didn't sit right about Emily's newfound interest in lawn care or her frequent visits to Rick's house. I tried to convince myself I was overthinking things. After all, I had no solid reason to doubt her. But no matter how much I rationalized, the nagging feeling wouldn't go away. One Saturday morning, Emily left to borrow a gardening tool from Rick. She said it casually, like it was no big deal, but I couldn't help noticing how quickly she fixed her hair and adjusted her clothes before stepping out the door. It wasn't unusual for Emily to want to look nice, she always took pride in her appearance, but this time, it felt different. Like she was putting in a little extra effort. She was gone for over an hour. I tried to keep myself busy, tinkering in the garage, but my thoughts kept drifting back to her. What could possibly take that long? When she finally returned, she seemed flustered, her cheeks flushed. She carried a small box of nails, which she set on the counter without a word. "Everything okay?" I asked, keeping my tone light. "Yeah, of course," she said quickly, avoiding my eyes as she poured herself a glass of water. "Rick and I were just chatting. You know how he is, always full of advice." She was right about that. Rick could talk for hours if you let him. Still, there was something in her tone, a hint of nervousness that set my teeth on edge. I didn't press her, though. I told myself I was being paranoid. But my paranoia only grew. Emily started spending more time outside, often under the guise of working on the lawn or tidying up the flower beds. It wasn't like her to spend so much time doing yard work, especially since she'd always left most of it to me in the past. I noticed she'd conveniently find reasons to be outside whenever Rick was out there too, whether he was mowing his lawn or washing his car. One evening, as we were eating dinner, I decided to test the waters. "You've been spending a lot of time with Rick lately," I said casually, slicing into my chicken. "He must be giving some great gardening tips." Emily glanced up from her plate, her fork paused midair. For a split second, her expression shifted, surprised, maybe even guilty, but she recovered quickly, offering me a tight smile. "Yeah, he's been really helpful," she said. "I mean, you know how much he loves this stuff. It's nice to get advice from someone who knows what they're doing." "That's true," I said, keeping my tone even. "Just don't let him steal you away as his full-time gardening assistant. I might start getting jealous." It was meant to be a joke, but her reaction caught me off guard. Instead of laughing, she froze for a moment, then let out a forced chuckle that sounded more nervous than amused. "Don't be ridiculous," she said, brushing off the comment. "Rick's just a neighbor. That's all." Her words were reassuring, but her tone wasn't. I felt like there was something she wasn't saying, but I didn't know how to bring it up without sounding accusatory. I didn't want to seem like the jealous, insecure husband, so I let it go, for now. Still, the unease lingered. I started paying closer attention, noting every time Emily mentioned Rick or found a reason to visit him. It became harder to ignore the growing list of inconsistencies. I told myself I was imagining things, but deep down, I knew I wasn't. Something wasn't right. And I was determined to find out what it was. My unease hit its peak one sunny afternoon. Emily was in the backyard, tidying up around the garden, when I noticed Rick leaning against the fence, talking to her. From where I stood inside the house, I couldn't hear their conversation, but their body language caught my attention. Rick was smiling, gesturing animatedly, and Emily was laughing, harder than I'd seen her laugh in weeks. She brushed a strand of hair behind her ear, a nervous habit of hers, and tilted her head slightly, as if hanging on to his every word. I told myself they were just being friendly neighbors, but something about the scene grated on me. It felt too familiar, too comfortable. That evening, as Emily cooked dinner, I decided to check our toolbox. Over the past few weeks, she'd borrowed countless items from Rick: tools, measuring cups, and who knows what else. I wanted to see if the things she claimed to borrow were actually missing. Maybe I was being paranoid, but I needed to know. I opened the drawer where we kept our gardening tools and quickly spotted the pruning shears. Strange. She'd borrowed those from Rick just last week. Then I checked the toolbox for nails. There they were, 2 boxes, unopened. The same nails she'd brought home after spending an hour at Rick's house. My heart sank as realization set in. She hadn't needed any of these items. The borrowing wasn't about the tools, it was an excuse to spend time with him. I slammed the toolbox shut, my chest tightening with a mix of anger and confusion. Why would she lie about something so trivial? If nothing was going on, why not just say she wanted to chat with Rick? The more I thought about it, the less sense it made. Later that week, I decided to keep a closer eye on Emily's routine. I didn't want to confront her without proof, but I couldn't keep ignoring the growing pit in my stomach. One afternoon, she told me she was heading over to Rick's to return some clippers she'd borrowed. I waited a few minutes after she left, then walked out onto the porch, pretending to check the mail. From my vantage point, I could see Rick's backyard through the gaps in the fence. Emily was there, but she wasn't just returning the clippers. She was standing closer to Rick than I'd ever seen her stand to anyone outside of family. They were talking, but it didn't look casual, it looked intense. Her arms were crossed, but not in the defensive way I'd expect if they were arguing. It was almost intimate. I stayed out there longer than I intended, trying to piece together what I was seeing. When she finally came back, I was back inside, pretending to read a magazine. She breezed through the door, looking a little flushed. "How was Rick?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. "Fine," she said quickly. "I just dropped off the clippers. Nothing exciting." The lie was so effortless, so casual, that it shook me. I didn't press her, but that night, as I lay in bed next to her, the distance between us felt like a chasm. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was going on, and whether I wanted to admit it or not, I was starting to fear the worst. All I needed was one moment, one undeniable clue to confirm my suspicions. Little did I know, that moment was just around the corner. The moment came sooner than I expected. It was a Wednesday afternoon, and I'd decided to come home early from work. I hadn't told Emily, I figured it would be a nice surprise. Lately, our conversations had felt strained, and I thought maybe a spontaneous lunch date could help us reconnect. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed Rick's car parked in front of his house. Nothing unusual there. But then I glanced at my own home and saw something that made my stomach twist. The curtains in the living room were drawn, a rare occurrence during the day. Emily loved natural light and usually kept them wide open until dusk. I parked quietly and walked up to the door, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. Maybe she was napping or watching a movie and didn't want the glare. But as I stepped inside, the house felt off. It was too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl. I set my keys down on the counter and listened. Faint voices came from upstairs, Emily's, along with a man's voice that I recognized instantly. Rick. My heart pounded in my chest as I moved toward the staircase, my footsteps slow and deliberate. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to turn around, to leave and pretend I didn't hear anything. But I couldn't. I had to know. As I climbed the stairs, the voices grew clearer. They were in our bedroom. My bedroom. I stopped outside the door, my hand hovering over the doorknob. I didn't want to open it. I didn't want to see whatever was happening on the other side. But something inside me, anger, betrayal, maybe both, propelled me forward. I pushed the door open, and there they were. Emily and Rick, tangled together on our bed, their faces a mixture of shock and panic when they saw me standing there. For a moment, none of us moved. It was like time had frozen, trapping us all in the horrible reality of the moment. "What the hell is this?" I managed to choke out, my voice trembling with rage and disbelief. Emily scrambled to cover herself, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. Rick stood, fumbling for his shirt, mumbling something incoherent about it not being what it looked like. But it was exactly what it looked like. There was no other explanation for what I'd walked in on. "I can't believe you," I said, my voice rising as the anger overtook me. "In our house? In our bed?" Emily started crying, her words tumbling out in a desperate attempt to explain. "I'm so sorry. It just happened. I didn't mean for this to happen." I cut her off, my voice dripping with venom. "What did you think would happen when you started sneaking around with him?" Rick tried to interject, but I wasn't having it. "And you," I said, turning to him. "You're supposed to be my neighbor, my friend. How could you do this?" He stammered out some weak excuse, but I didn't care. I was done listening. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the room, my chest heaving with a mix of fury and heartbreak. Emily followed me, pleading, but her words felt like noise, meaningless against the tidal wave of betrayal crashing over me. I left the house that day feeling like my world had been torn apart. The woman I loved, the life we'd built together, it all felt like a lie. And I knew, even then, that nothing would ever be the same again. After walking out of the house, I got in my truck and drove aimlessly, not caring where I ended up. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, and my thoughts raced in a chaotic loop. I couldn't believe what I'd just seen. Emily, my wife, the woman I trusted more than anyone, had betrayed me. And with Rick, of all people. I finally pulled into an empty parking lot and sat there, staring blankly at the dashboard. The shock hadn't worn off yet, it clung to me like a heavy, suffocating blanket. My mind kept replaying the image of them together, each detail sharper than the last, slicing through whatever illusions I'd clung to about our marriage. I didn't cry. Not then. I was too angry, too numb to feel anything but the white-hot rage coursing through me. How long had this been going on? Was it just a fling, or had it been happening for months? Years? The questions came fast and furious, but the answers felt irrelevant. The damage was already done. I thought about calling someone, my brother, a friend, but what would I even say? How do you tell someone that your wife, the person you've built your life around, has shattered everything in an instant? The humiliation alone was enough to keep my phone in my pocket. Eventually, I decided to head to a motel. I couldn't go back home, not yet. The thought of stepping into that house, of seeing her, was unbearable. I checked into a cheap room, the kind with a buzzing neon sign out front, and spent the rest of the night staring at the ceiling, my thoughts spiraling deeper into despair. The next day, Emily called me. I ignored her first few attempts, but eventually, I picked up. "Please, can we talk?" she said, her voice breaking. "I know I messed up. I just need you to hear me out." I didn't have the strength to argue, so I agreed to meet her later that evening. When I arrived back at the house, she was waiting for me in the living room, her face pale and her eyes red from crying. She looked small, almost fragile, but I wasn't ready to let my guard down. "Say whatever you need to say," I told her, my voice cold and distant. Emily launched into a rambling explanation, her words tripping over each other in her haste to make me understand. She talked about feeling neglected, about how Rick had been there for her when she was struggling. She said she never meant for it to go this far, that it was a mistake, that she still loved me. Her excuses didn't land the way she wanted them to. All I could think about was how she'd chosen to confide in him instead of me, how she'd betrayed my trust in the most intimate way possible. "I don't want to hear excuses," I said, cutting her off. I want to know why. Why him? Why us? She couldn't answer. Not really. Her words sounded hollow, like she didn't fully understand her own actions. And maybe that was the worst part, knowing she'd thrown away everything we had for something she couldn't even explain. That night, I slept in the guest room. Emily cried herself to sleep in the bedroom, but her tears didn't move me. I was too broken to feel anything but the jagged edges of my own pain. The weight of what had happened pressed down on me, suffocating and relentless. I didn't know if we could recover from this, or if I even wanted to try. The days following the confrontation were a blur. Every moment felt heavy, like I was dragging myself through quicksand. I stayed in the guest room, avoiding Emily as much as possible. The silence in the house was deafening. The once warm spaces that held years of shared laughter and love now felt cold and suffocating. Emily tried to talk to me several times, but I couldn't bring myself to engage. Each time I saw her, all I could picture was her with Rick. The betrayal replayed in my mind like a cruel movie on an endless loop. I kept asking myself the same questions, over and over. Was there something I missed? Was I not enough? Had I failed as a husband? I didn't want to talk to anyone about what had happened. The shame of it was unbearable. I couldn't stomach the thought of my friends or family knowing that the woman I loved had betrayed me so deeply. I felt isolated, trapped in my own torment. One night, a few days after the incident, Emily finally cornered me in the kitchen. I was fixing a quick sandwich, trying to keep my head down, but she stood in the doorway, blocking my escape. "Can we just talk?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I sighed, setting down the knife I'd been using to spread mayonnaise. "What is there to talk about, Emily? You cheated. You lied. What more do you think I need to hear?" Tears welled up in her eyes, but I was too angry to feel any sympathy. She took a shaky breath and began to speak. "I know I've hurt you, and I'll never forgive myself for it," she said. "But I need you to know that I still love you. What I did was wrong, but it doesn't change how much you mean to me." I laughed bitterly. "You've got a funny way of showing it." "I'm serious, James," she pleaded. "Rick, it wasn't about love. It wasn't about replacing you. I was just... I don't know. I felt lost, and he was there. But it didn't mean anything. You're the one I want to be with." Her words sounded desperate, but they did little to soothe the gaping wound in my chest. I didn't doubt that she felt regret, but regret didn't undo what she'd done. It didn't erase the image of her in our bed with another man. "I don't know if I can do this," I said finally, my voice heavy with exhaustion. "I don't know if I can ever trust you again." Her face crumpled, and she started sobbing, her shoulders shaking as she leaned against the counter. Part of me wanted to comfort her, to wrap my arms around her and tell her everything would be okay. But I couldn't. Not after what she'd done. "I'll do anything," she said through her tears. "Therapy, counseling, whatever it takes. Just tell me how to fix this." I shook my head. "I don't have an answer for you, Emily. Right now, I just need space." That night, I packed a bag and left the house. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay there. The walls of that house were closing in on me, suffocating me with memories of what had happened. I needed air. I needed distance. And most of all, I needed time to figure out if I could ever look at Emily the same way again. I stayed in a cheap motel for a while, the same one I'd gone to right after catching Emily and Rick together. It wasn't much, just a small room with peeling wallpaper and a flickering TV, but it gave me the space I desperately needed. I spent most nights lying on the stiff mattress, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of everything. Emily called and texted me daily, pleading for me to come home. She said all the things you'd expect, how sorry she was, how much she wanted to fix things, how she'd do anything to make it right. But every time I saw her name pop up on my phone, a wave of anger and sadness washed over me. I wasn't ready to face her yet. One night, I finally picked up her call. She sounded tired, like she hadn't slept in days. "James," she said softly, "please come back. We can't fix this if you're not here." I sighed, running a hand through my hair. "Emily, I don't even know where to start. How am I supposed to look at you and not see him?" Her voice cracked. "I know I can't undo what I did. But I swear to you, it's over. Rick and it was a mistake. It was stupid and selfish, and I hate myself for it. But you're my husband. I love you. I want to spend my life with you, not him." I didn't know what to say. Her words sounded sincere, but the damage was already done. The trust that had once been the foundation of our relationship was now in pieces. Still, part of me wanted to believe her. Part of me wanted to believe that we could somehow move past this, even though I had no idea how. After a long pause, I said, "I'll come back, but only to talk. I'm not making any promises." When I arrived at the house, Emily was waiting for me in the living room. She looked like she'd been crying, her eyes were red and puffy, and her hands trembled as she gestured for me to sit. I took a seat across from her, keeping my distance. "I've been thinking a lot about us," she began, her voice shaky. "About what I've done and how much I've hurt you. And I know it might be too late, but I want to fight for this. For us." I looked at her, trying to read her expression. She seemed genuine, but the betrayal still burned too fresh in my mind. "I don't know if I can fight for this," I admitted. "I don't know if I even want to." Her face crumpled, and she started crying again. "Please, James. Don't give up on us. We've built a life together, a good life. I know I messed up, but I'll do whatever it takes to make it right. I'll prove to you that I can be better." We spent hours talking that night, hashing out everything, the betrayal, the hurt, the confusion. She promised she'd cut all ties with Rick, that she'd never even speak to him again. She said she'd go to counseling, that she'd do anything to rebuild the trust she'd destroyed. For a brief moment, I thought maybe, just maybe, we had a chance. But as the days went on, it became clear that rebuilding wouldn't be easy. Every time I looked at her, I felt a pang of resentment. Every time her phone buzzed, my mind jumped to the worst conclusions. Even though she'd sworn it was over with Rick, the paranoia ate away at me. I didn't trust her, and I didn't trust myself to let it go. We tried to move forward, but the cracks in our marriage were too deep. Conversations turned into arguments, and the tension in the house became unbearable. I could see that Emily was trying. She'd stop by my motel to bring me dinner or leave me heartfelt notes, but none of it could erase what had happened. One evening, after another heated argument, I knew I couldn't do it anymore. I packed my bags and told her I was leaving for good. The look on her face broke me, but I knew staying would only prolong the inevitable. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I can't live like this. I can't pretend everything's okay when it's not." She didn't try to stop me this time. She just stood there, tears streaming down her face, as I walked out the door. It felt like the end of everything we'd built together, and maybe it was. But I also knew that staying would destroy what little was left of me. For both of our sakes, it was time to let go. Leaving the house that night felt like closing a chapter one never wanted to write. I drove for hours, aimlessly, until I ended up at my brother Mike's place on the other side of town. I hadn't told him anything about what had been going on, but as soon as he opened the door and saw the look on my face, he didn't ask any questions. Mike had always been the strong, silent type, but he knew when to offer support without prying. He gave me a beer, a spot on his couch, and space to sort through my thoughts. Over the next few days, I started telling him everything, the betrayal, the lies, the failed attempts to salvage my marriage. Saying it out loud felt surreal, like I was recounting someone else's life instead of my own. "You can't stay in that house, man," Mike said one evening as we sat in his backyard. "Every time you look at it, you're going to remember what happened. You need a clean break." He was right. Staying in that neighborhood would mean living with constant reminders of Emily and Rick. The thought of seeing Rick's smug face or passing by the spot where I'd caught them together made my stomach turn. I couldn't do it. A week later, I started looking for a new place. I didn't want to stay in the same town, where the gossip would eventually catch up with me. People in our neighborhood talked, and it was only a matter of time before whispers about Emily and Rick's affair spread like wildfire. I wanted to get as far away from it as possible. I found a small apartment in a neighboring city, about 40 miles from where I'd lived with Emily. It wasn't anything fancy, a one-bedroom unit with peeling paint and outdated fixtures, but it felt like a fresh start. I signed the lease and started moving my things in. Packing up my belongings was harder than I expected. Every box felt like a goodbye to the life I thought I had, to the dreams I'd built with Emily. I didn't tell her where I was moving. We'd talked a few times since I left, mostly logistical things about bills and splitting up our stuff, but I kept the conversations short. She tried to bring up reconciliation a couple of times, but I shut it down. I couldn't go back, not after everything that had happened. The first night in my new apartment was eerily quiet. I sat on the couch, surrounded by boxes, and stared out the window at the unfamiliar street below. It felt strange to be starting over at my age. I was 35, and I'd always assumed my life was set, married, settled, secure. Now, I was alone, trying to rebuild from the ground up. But as painful as it was, there was also a sense of relief. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. I didn't have to look over my shoulder, wondering if Emily was telling the truth. I didn't have to second-guess every interaction, every word. I was free, but freedom came with its own kind of loneliness. The nights were the hardest. I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the life I'd lost. I missed Emily, despite everything. I missed the way she used to curl up next to me on the couch, the way she laughed at my dumb jokes, the way she made our house feel like a home. But then I'd remember her betrayal, and the anger would come rushing back, drowning out the nostalgia. It was a strange mix of emotions, love, anger, sadness, and relief, all tangled together in a way I couldn't fully understand. But I knew one thing for certain, I couldn't go back. Moving forward was the only option, even if I didn't know what that future looked like yet. As I tried to settle into my new life, the fallout from Emily and Rick's affair continued to unfold in the neighborhood I'd left behind. Word got out, because it always does in small communities like ours. I didn't go looking for updates, but every so often, someone would reach out to me with the latest news. The most shocking revelation came when I learned that Lisa, Rick's wife, had discovered the affair. Apparently, she hadn't known at first. Rick must have thought he could keep it under wraps, but secrets like that have a way of surfacing. Lisa found out through another neighbor who overheard Emily and Rick talking in his backyard. The rumor made its way to Lisa, and once she confronted Rick, everything unraveled. I got a call about it from a former coworker who still lived in the neighborhood. "Did you hear what happened with Rick and Lisa?" he asked, his tone thick with awkward curiosity. "No, and I don't really want to know," I replied, though part of me couldn't help being curious. "Well, she kicked him out. It's a mess. She's been telling everyone what he did, and it's gotten pretty ugly." I wasn't surprised. Lisa had always seemed like the no-nonsense type. I imagined she must have felt just as blindsided and betrayed as I had. The idea of Rick's smug confidence crumbling under Lisa's wrath gave me a small, bitter sense of satisfaction. Despite the chaos in their lives, I didn't feel any relief. Instead, it deepened my sense of loss. 2 marriages destroyed. 2 lives torn apart because of selfish decisions and fleeting moments of betrayal. It was like a ripple effect, spreading pain far beyond just Emily and me. Emily tried to reach out again, once she realized I'd heard about Rick and Lisa. She called me one evening, her voice shaky and hesitant. "James, I just wanted to say that I'm sorry. For everything. I know I've said it before, but I mean it. I never wanted things to end up like this. I'm not interested in apologies anymore, Emily," I said, my voice firmer than I expected. "They don't change what happened. They don't fix anything." There was a long pause before she spoke again. "I know. I don't know how to move on from this. From you." It was the first time I heard genuine defeat in her voice, but I couldn't let myself feel sympathy. "That's something you're going to have to figure out on your own," I said before ending the call. Despite her pleas, I knew there was no going back. I couldn't rebuild a marriage on broken trust, no matter how much she wanted to make things right. And honestly, I wasn't sure if she truly wanted me, or if she just couldn't bear the thought of being alone. Either way, it didn't matter. I'd made my choice. The news about Rick and Lisa eventually faded from the forefront of my thoughts, but it lingered as a reminder of how much damage had been done. Emily and Rick's betrayal hadn't just destroyed one family, it had shattered two. And the pieces were scattered too far to ever put back together again. The months after leaving Emily felt like wading through uncharted territory. Each day was a mix of progress and setbacks. Some mornings, I'd wake up feeling like I was finally moving forward, ready to start over. Other days, the weight of everything that had happened would hit me like a freight train, leaving me questioning everything about myself and my choices. I heard less and less about Emily and Rick as time went on. The neighborhood gossip seemed to die down, or maybe people just stopped updating me. I didn't ask, and I didn't want to know. What little I did hear suggested that life hadn't been kind to either of them. Rick had moved out of the neighborhood entirely after Lisa's divorce proceedings began. His reputation, once that of the friendly, helpful neighbor, was in shambles. As for Emily, she'd stayed in the house, but it wasn't the same without me there. A mutual friend mentioned running into her at the grocery store and said she looked worn down, like the weight of everything was catching up to her. "She asked about you," the friend said, almost apologetically. "Said she hoped you were doing okay." I didn't know how to respond to that. Part of me appreciated that she still cared, but another part of me felt like her concern was too little, too late. She'd made her choices, and I was still living with the fallout. For a long time, I avoided dating. I couldn't even think about opening up to someone new, not when my trust had been so completely shattered. I threw myself into work, volunteering for overtime and taking on extra projects just to keep my mind occupied. It helped, but only to a point. The quiet moments, the ones at the end of the day when there was nothing to distract me, were the hardest. That's when the memories would creep in, and the questions I couldn't answer would surface. One day, while unpacking a box I'd barely touched since moving into my apartment, I found an old photo album. It was filled with pictures of me and Emily from the early years of our marriage, vacations, holidays, random snapshots of everyday life. We looked so happy in those photos, so carefree. I sat on the floor, flipping through the pages, feeling a bittersweet ache in my chest. The love we'd shared was real. I knew that. But so was the betrayal, and no amount of nostalgia could change that. It took a long time, but eventually, I started to feel like myself again. The pain didn't disappear, it was still there, like a scar, but it became less raw. I began to realize that while Emily's actions had hurt me deeply, they didn't define who I was. I was more than the man who'd been cheated on. I was still me, and I still had a life worth living. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was ready to start building something new. As the months stretched into a year, my life began to take on a new rhythm. It wasn't easy, but the slow and steady process of healing had started to show its results. My apartment, once a cold and impersonal space, now felt like home. I'd hung a few pictures on the walls, picked out some furniture that matched my taste, and even started a small herb garden on the windowsill, something Emily had always loved, and I found oddly therapeutic to care for. Work kept me grounded, but I also began making an effort to rebuild my social life. Mike, my brother, had been a lifeline through the darkest days, and he encouraged me to get back out there. It started small, grabbing beers with coworkers, attending a cookout Mike hosted, and reconnecting with a few old friends I hadn't seen in years. Slowly, I remembered what it was like to enjoy life again, even in the simplest ways. Then, one day, something unexpected happened. I was at a bookstore on a quiet Saturday afternoon, browsing for something to read. The store was nearly empty, the soft hum of background music creating a calm, welcoming atmosphere. As I flipped through a novel, I heard a voice behind me. "That's a good one. The ending will surprise you, though." I turned to see a woman about my age, her smile warm and easy. She had dark brown hair that fell just past her shoulders and wore a casual sweater and jeans. She held a book in her hands, but her attention was fully on me. "Oh yeah?" I said, returning her smile. "I guess I'll have to find out." We started talking, first about books, then about anything and everything. Her name was Claire, and she had an energy about her that was both calming and invigorating. She told me she was an elementary school teacher, and I found myself genuinely interested in hearing about her life. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't weighed down by the past. I was just present. Before we parted ways, Claire suggested a coffee shop down the street that served the best lattes she'd ever had. I took a chance and asked if she'd like to grab one with me. To my surprise, she said yes. That afternoon turned into one of the best days I'd had in years. We talked for hours over coffee, sharing stories and laughing like old friends. It felt easy, natural, like we'd known each other forever. For the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of hope that I might be able to trust again, to let someone new into my life. I didn't rush things with Claire. I'd learned the hard way that relationships aren't something to take lightly. But as we started seeing each other more often, I couldn't deny that there was something special about her. She was patient and understanding, never prying into my past but always listening when I chose to share. She didn't try to fix me, she just accepted me as I was, scars and all. Claire reminded me that life doesn't end with heartbreak. It changes, yes, but it goes on. And sometimes, it leads you to something you never expected. I wasn't sure where things would go with her, but for the first time in a long time, I was excited to find out. While my life was beginning to show signs of hope and healing, I occasionally thought about Emily and the path her life had taken. I hadn't heard much about her since we'd parted ways, but every now and then, news trickled in through mutual acquaintances or friends who still lived in the old neighborhood. From what I gathered, things hadn't gone well for her. She'd stayed in the house for a while, but without me there to share the load, the place had become more of a burden than a comfort. The financial strain of managing everything on her own eventually forced her to sell the house. She moved into a small apartment across town, far from the neighborhood where everything had fallen apart. Emily had tried to maintain friendships with some of our neighbors, but the fallout from her affair with Rick had left her isolated. People weren't unkind to her, but they kept their distance. The betrayal had left a mark on the community, and the easy camaraderie she once shared with everyone was gone. As for Rick, his life had taken an equally sharp downward turn. After Lisa kicked him out, he moved to a different city, far enough away to escape the whispers and judgment. From what I heard, he struggled to find steady work and spent most of his time bouncing between temporary jobs and short-term living arrangements. Lisa finalized the divorce and didn't look back, cutting off all contact with him. Emily and Rick didn't stay together. Whatever connection they thought they had dissolved quickly once the reality of their actions set in. The excitement, the secrecy, the thrill, it all crumbled under the weight of guilt and the harsh truth of what they'd done. They'd destroyed 2 marriages and left behind a trail of pain, and in the end, they had nothing to show for it. Despite everything, I didn't feel any sense of satisfaction in their struggles. If anything, it only deepened the sadness I felt about the whole ordeal. Emily wasn't a bad person, she was someone who'd made terrible choices and lost her way. But those choices had consequences, ones that neither of us could escape. Meanwhile, my life with Claire was slowly blossoming into something meaningful. She was nothing like Emily, and that was part of what drew me to her. Where Emily had been bold and outgoing, Claire was steady and grounded. She had a calming presence, the kind that made me feel like I could finally let my guard down. I'd told Claire about Emily, not everything, but enough to give her an idea of why I was cautious about relationships. She didn't push me for details or try to rush things. She let me set the pace, and for that, I was deeply grateful. As our relationship grew, I began to feel something I hadn't felt in years: peace. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever is, but it was honest. Claire and I built something new, something free from the shadows of my past. It wasn't about erasing what had happened but learning to live with it, to grow from it. Looking back, I realized that the pain Emily and Rick had caused me didn't have to define my future. It had shaped me, yes, but it hadn't broken me. In the end, I'd found a way to move forward, and for that, I was thankful. As I sit here reflecting on everything that's happened, I'm struck by how much my life has changed in such a short time. A year ago, I couldn't have imagined finding peace, let alone happiness, after what Emily and Rick did. But life has a way of surprising you, sometimes in the worst ways, but other times in ways that remind you of your own strength. The pain of betrayal is unlike anything I've ever experienced. It tears at your soul, making you question everything you thought you knew about love, trust, and yourself. For a long time, I carried that pain like a weight on my shoulders, certain it would crush me. But eventually, I learned to let it go, not all at once, but piece by piece, day by day. One of the biggest lessons I've learned is the importance of setting boundaries and protecting your own well-being. I gave Emily everything, my trust, my love, my faith, and she threw it away. It's a hard truth to accept, but I've come to realize that her betrayal wasn't a reflection of my worth. It was a reflection of her own choices and shortcomings. I've also learned the value of resilience. When my world fell apart, I thought I'd never recover. But I did. I found a new home, a new perspective, and even a new relationship. Claire has been a gift I never expected, someone who's shown me that love doesn't have to be perfect to be meaningful. She's patient, kind, and understanding in a way that makes me feel like I can be myself again. If I could offer advice to anyone going through a similar experience, it would be this: take your time. Healing isn't linear, and it's not something you can rush. Allow yourself to grieve, to be angry, to feel everything you need to feel. But don't let it consume you. Life goes on, and you deserve to find happiness again, whether that's on your own or with someone new. Finally, I've come to believe that forgiveness isn't about excusing what happened. It's about freeing yourself from the anger and bitterness that can hold you hostage. I don't hate Emily anymore. I don't even hate Rick. I feel sorry for them, in a way, because they let something fleeting destroy so much. But their choices are no longer my burden to carry. As for me, I'm moving forward. Claire and I are still taking things slow, but for the first time in years, I feel hopeful about the future. I don't know where life will take us, but I'm ready to find out. This chapter of my life has been painful, but it's also been transformative. I've learned that even in the darkest moments, there's a way through the pain. And when you come out on the other side, you're stronger, wiser, and more prepared to embrace whatever comes next. If nothing else, I've learned that life is messy, unpredictable, and often unfair. But it's also beautiful in its resilience, its ability to keep moving forward no matter how many times you fall. And in that, I've found my peace.